Hey guys, Spazzy Dragon here, aka Syndromes, and welcome back to the adventures of Oliver Gregory. Now, before I start today's episode, I need to run by a quick clarification, which if I don't, thanks Discord, is going to come up later in the video in the comments. The footage of Greg that you're currently watching has been recorded at the very late December 2018 and very early in January 2019. At the time of posting this video, on March 2019, there's an ongoing roleplay event in Omega 3 which, due to the age of this footage, is not going to be portrayed in Oliver's adventures. And actually, in reality, at the time of editing this video, I haven't actually been able to log on Discovery Freelancer for a couple of months due to what I can only assume is an ISP reason, but the amount of video I currently have in reserve should hold out until I can fix it, and so with that in mind, let's go with episode 3. Oliver Gregg is about to set off on one of the most longest business trips he has done ever in his life. It's been a few days since his rather illuminating talk with the captain of the Cryer supertransport, but he's not actually been in space since then. Instead, Oliver has spent most of his time in the bar of Freeport 1, but he hasn't been wasting his time drinking, or to be more precise, not by himself at least, but instead he has been scanning the arriving groups for anyone bearing markings of any of the nearby mining factions. Now, once he did find a group that didn't tell him to piss off, and instead agreed to answer some of his questions as long as he bought them around, Greg finally was getting some answers regarding his most likely more profitable upcoming choices in life. A few more rounds later, and a quick trip down to the docking bay with a group of people he met in order to take a look at his shuttle, and Greg finally launches into space again, while knowing full well that he's risking a lot by doing so. So, back before he fled Bretonia, Greg wasn't really a complete tool. You know, his choice to flee a war by going to the Omegas withstanding, but apart from pawning anything he couldn't bring with himself, he took out a big loan, or at least as much as someone of his age and credit rating could. It's not like Greg is broke. Actually, he could live easily on the Freeport 1 for nearly half a year with what he currently has. However, the amount of credits starts to evaporate the moment he starts using his shuttle. Maintaining a space-worthy ship is very expensive, which is why most of the traffic you see around is either by pilots hired by a company to fly their ships, or wealthy individual freelancers with either the skill, such as bounty hunters and such, or the equipment, aka freelancing miners, to be self-sustained. Greg, as he is right now, is neither of those things. Yet. But before I carry on, I need to very quickly bring up a few things about how I interpret the game environment and how it translates to the roleplay environment that I then narrate on top of this video. In the upcoming episodes, you will see many instances where I purposefully decouple the gameplay and the roleplay at key moments due to various reasons. Now, you've already seen me describe how a character simply taking a lane or a gate results in large differences in time that when the game offers, right? Because apart from many other things, such as the size of a ship and a planet, Freelancer was never really good when it comes to portraying time and distance. The only place where it does mention this, by the way, if you ever bothered to check it out, is in Trent's diary in the single player, where he describes the happenings of his adventure. For example, by the time he reaches the Sigmas, he already writes that it's already been a month since he last left Liberty. It is obviously a gameplay choice, because while it makes no sense that a military conflict between two superpowers can take place in a location 10 minutes away from their capital systems, but it also simply makes the whole game world feel unrealistically small if you just take the gameplay and translate it into just straight to roleplay, where you can fly between Bretonia and Liberty in a matter of 10 or 15 minutes. The reason why I bring this up is to note that this is not written anywhere in the server rules, as in, this is something that I personally use to make the roleplay in Disco make more sense and it's easier to work with. But this is not only not the norm, nor is it accepted by the majority of the Discovery Freelancer community. It's also easier to put into context in post-production be it when you're writing some sort of character story or message dump, or like me, if you're making a video. Because actually, to keep track of all these discrepancies, it's also almost impossible to keep track in real time when you're flying around with and, you know, talking with other people. So in other words, if you find yourself unable to do this properly, or you'd rather not do this in the first place, don't worry about it, as this is just something that I personally do for my own reasons. So, the thing that Greg was inquiring about back on Freeport 1 was whether or not there was any point to waste his fuel on getting to the local cobalt mining operation itself. Now, once he got off the transit lanes, he almost has a whole day of spending in autopilot in order to even get there, so the most pressing matter at the hand was if trying to haul ore in his dinky little shuttle was even worth it, or even possible in the first place. And as it turned out, then yes, it is. Kind of. Now, the way the modern mining ships such as the Hegemon works is that the ship itself is automated systems that scan, process, break up the ore-containing rocks, and then use the ship's onboard tractor beam to bring them on board for storage and processing. Now, the mining lasers themselves are specifically designed to be efficient at what they do, while the scanner equipment itself deals with figuring out which stones to shoot, which stones contain the ore, and obviously for a large purpose-built ship like the Hegemon, it's in by itself a small house, so the crew operating it can simply let it do, quote, its own thing until they are greenlit for return to the processing plant. Greg, on the other hand, will just have to ghetto-rig his own mining operation the best way he can. His ship does not have any of those fancy automated systems, but it does have a very simple set of civilian-grade defense lasers that he can break up the ore with. He also learned that the ship's onboard optics can simply use a laser to see whether or not any of the cracked open rocks has exposed cobalt veins. Now obviously by doing this, Greg is basically running blind and leaving out huge amounts of ore that he just doesn't know that he needs to pick up. And obviously he also needs to manually fire and then maneuver the rocks into his cargo hold, but the shuttle itself can surprisingly hold around 40 metric tons of unprocessing ore. Again, Greg is a shuttle pilot. He is basically a 16-wheeler driver, if you really want to draw parallels with, real-world things. So, again, that it makes sense. And, well, that he can just go and take it to the processing plant and simply hope that the amount of credits he gets is going to be worth the effort. And yeah, it turns out that yes, indeed, if you land yourself equipment used in large corporations and you have the skills to make use of it, you can make the sort of money that far exceeds the amount required for one person to survive in space. Again, having a shuttle of your own, regardless of how you obtained it, and as long as you get enough credits to maintain it, in the world of Freelancer, it's basically like the story of Cornelius Vanderbilt in the 18th century. So the guy somehow, history seems to be very vague about this, obtained himself a ferry, which over time provided transportation services between Staten Island and Manhattan. Basically, his one ferry soon became two, then one more, and soon he had a fleet on him. But obviously he needed that first ship and a thriving market for his services. And that is the amusing thing. Technically, the story of Oliver Gregory could end here, where he has not only found himself a new home in the Omegas, but he also has the means to take part of a highly lucrative source of revenue, which, again, is far beyond the reach of regular individuals. Again, tapping into the resources of deep space, even as a single individual, gets you nowhere near the income made by super factions such as the AMG or Kruger, but at the same time, it eclipses the income of any mid to large-scale corporation back planetside. But of course, a certain encounter happens that changes Greg's view on the, quote, order of things in the Sirius sector. Now, this happens roughly a week later after his first expedition to the cobalt mining fields, and during this time span, Greg has not only returned there twice, but he has also gotten himself a reply on his request to obtain a jump pass into Rhineland. Now, this jump pass comes in the form of an old freighter which has been salvaged by the local junkers. It's hard to tell who it belonged to before it ended up floating in space, and later on brought back on the dry docks of Freeport 1, but the nav computer still has the digital key necessary to make his trip to New Berlin. But right now, it seems to be rather irrelevant to Greg, who seems to be enjoying his newfound life as a self-employed miner. So, what happened? Just what sort of tragedy could have happened to Greg in order to have him give up this idyllic little lifestyle? Well, it begins with yet another supertransport, this time owned by the ALG Waste Disposal Company and named the Procyon 2, as its captain announces in the system-wide civilian comms whether or not there's any mining ships present in the system. Now, it's already been almost a week for Greg, and the overall state of things have been starting to rub off on him, so obviously his first question is, depends, what's the information worth to you? Whether or not this was meant to be a joke on his part, given that Greg was actually in a very good mood given the circumstances, it's kind of lost to the sands of time, but the captain of the Procyon seems to be completely ignored, and instead they clarify that they are looking for a willing miner that would, instead of having them buy or store on one of the bases, they were willing to pay directly. That in by itself is a very good deal for someone like Greg. After all, he gets paid 3,000 credits per metric ton of the stuff on a refinery, but he can only carry 40 tons per ship. Only 40 tons. Freelancer, welcome to the future. However, if he's hired by a transport, even though if they agree to pay him less than the refinery, it saves him the long times to commute, and he's much better off. And so with that, he agrees. By the time Greg's shuttle finally arrives to the mining field, though, Greg realizes just what he has signed up for, in his first reaction being a wholehearted hell no, given the size of the ship he's currently staring at. Obviously, the fact that the Procyon was the name of a goddamn super transport is the sort of information Greg's only learns now. Now that being said, the captain of the ship states that there's no rush, and after agreeing on the size of the payment, note that Greg is actually judging the cost of a third of what Procyon would pay for the refinery, Greg gets to work. Obviously, during this time, the captain and the crew of the supertransport are free to do whatever, and given the size of their ship, I wouldn't even lift an eyebrow if someone told me that they actually have a separate bar in it. And even so, Greg is left in the radio silence of his current job as he starts shooting up the nearby stones in order to gather the ones showing ore. Please keep in mind that the proper mining ships have automated the process, and as for Greg's dinky little shuttle, not so much. I'm not really going to guess how much time this takes, but at some point Greg, after scanning the hold of the ship and realizing he has mined, quote, only 10 times his usual shipment, flips the table and states, this. Now, it's not to say that the amount of money Greg just made himself was small, but the means to achieve it struck him as something straight out of a propaganda poster that he has seen back on New London, where it would state that if the GRN won the fight, they could put the civilian populace to work at the mines and processing stations back home. Greg's little idyllic dreams of becoming a miner shatters right here and right now, with a man having mined more than enough for his life and sitting in the radio silence of the ship while the wealthy captain of the ship in front of him was probably grabbing a nap. Screw mining, screw the LG, Greg thinks to himself as he flies off. After all, there's still a certain salvage freighter that is just begging to be bought, and after this little encounter, the prospect of that seems all the more enticing. And so ends episode number 3 of The Adventures of Oliver Gregory. Traumatized by honest work and... effort. This is not the life that he deserted his home and abandoned his family for. Greg has decided that he needs to get as far away from this nonsense as possible, and after he reached Freeport 1, he gets in touch with the appropriate people about the new ship and its jump access, and then, without looking back, he sells his family shuttle. You know, perhaps this is the moment where Greg truly cuts off the ties with his old life and his old ideals. The opportunity he has in the vastness of space, as he figures it out, has nothing to do with the amount of personal effort he has to put into his life. Just like with that ALG and Cryer captains, they seem to have no regard for the rules for the latter and the effort and honest work for the former. Greg has finally seen the world for what it is, and perhaps, by accident, the one that he chose to partake in. He would be much smarter now, much careful of his decisions. But now, it's time to visit Rhineland and figure out if the grass is greener on the other side of the fence. Thanks for watching, guys. I am very glad for the feedback and comments that you've been given, and I think I have enough material for one more episode for Greg, and from there we'll figure out what we can do with this sort of style of Let's Play. Because if and when I fix my connectivity issues, Greg is by far not the only character that we can spectate in this sort of narration-based videos. But time will tell. This is Fancy Dragon, aka Syndromes. Fly safe.